This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of The Last Halloween, Urbanity Planet, and Odysseus the Rebel. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we're two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
And on the October episode of the webcomic series, Sean and I are going to be discussing two current ongoing and one already completed webcomic. We're going to begin with Abby Howard's The Last Halloween. After that, we're going to take a look at a much newer webcomic, Urbanity Planet, written and drawn by Theora Kvitka. And then after a brief checkup with those guys, Jim McClain and Paul Schultz, we're going to look at Stephen Grant and Scott Bieser's Odysseus the Rebel. But before we get into those webcomics, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And we also have to point out their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. If you prefer your comics in a more electronic format, they provide a lot of the same great comics available in PDF and CBZ formats, which are all DRM free. Always a bonus there. And any purchase that you make on mydigitalcomics.com also counts at 5% off towards your DCBS purchase. So you can buy your electronic comics and then get a discount on your paper ones as well.
That's right. So whether you like the digits or the paper, you can't go wrong with the guys at dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Well, Sean, before we get into this month's webcomics, and there's a lot for us to discuss, we should probably share with our listeners some listener response that we received.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Well, it's not just listener response, I think we're talking this time either. We're talking... We heard back from one of the creators of one of the webcomics that we were actually discussing a few months back.
Well, actually, it was just last month. Remember, one of the titles that we discussed in September was Kill 6 Billion Demons by Tom Parkinson Morgan. And when that show went up, and, you know, I announce things on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, basically do the social media run. And Tom on Twitter, you know, saw the notice, listened to the podcast episode, and liked what we had to say, not only because we had good things to say about Kill 6 Billion Demons, but because he also thought we had some great suggestions about the organization, or the lack thereof, of his website. And then after he changed his website, he tweeted out to us, he says, "Thanks to the inspiration from at Two Guys with PhDs, which is our Twitter handle, I went and un-effed," he didn't say effed, "I un-effed my archive and added better navigation to my site. So cheers, guys."
That was great to hear. As you know, that was really, as I recall, that was pretty much the only complaint of any sort that we had on about his story, about his site, was just some of the navigation. And you know, it's great to see that people are out there working on this stuff, and that they're willing to take some criticism and say, oh, hey, you know what? I'm trying to make this the best experience that I can. And if somebody sees something that's not ideal, I can work on that and try to make it better, make it a better webcomic for everybody involved.
Right. And so, thank you very much, Tom, for thanking us. And it's good to know that some suggestions that we may have made on the show were actually taken to heart. And, it's worth noting, Sean, that it seems to me, and I haven't gone back to quantify this, like listen to all of our webcomics episodes and see if this is indeed the case, but I would guess the majority of the criticisms we make, positive criticisms, right? Not, blanket, really negative stuff.
Right.
But the majority of those probably deal much less with story content than it does with the design of the website.
I've noticed that myself too. Again, I haven't done like a quantitative analysis on what we've talked about, but that seems to be the case from my interpretation as well. And it makes sense at some level, right? And I think we've talked about this before, is that a lot of these folks are out there and they just want to get their story out to the world, and they're trying to do the best story that they can. And in most cases, they're doing a fantastic job. Mm-hmm. But they're not necessarily experts in web design, or they're not as experts in user experience or anything like that. So if anything ends up being worth criticizing, it often ends up being that the navigation or the structure of the website itself, and has nothing to do with the story. And there's just a lot out there. They're basically acting as writer, artist, publisher, editor, marketing, the whole nine yards. And there's very few people who are that well versed in that many different aspects of publishing and web design that can pull all of that off successfully by themselves. Right.
So again, we want to thank Tom Parkinson Morgan, or as he goes by on Twitter, at Orbital Dropkick. So thank him for that comment. And, if you guys want to check our check out our discussion of Kill 6 Billion Demons, you can go to the website comicsalternative.com and check out last month's webcomic episode. And then definitely look for Tom's webcomic at Kill 6 Billion Demons, and that's one word, kill6billiondemons.com. So, Sean, you want to get into this month's webcomics?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you gave us a shout out at the top, said we're just going to start off with Last Halloween. And I think that's a great subject to start with, as we are in the middle of October at this point.
That's right. And last year, in our October webcomics episode, I think we looked at all horror comics because it was the month of Halloween. This time around, we thought that we would just look at one Halloween specific or horror specific title, and then the other two. But this one had Halloween in its title, so definitely appropriate. This is written and drawn by Abby Howard, and you can find it at last-halloween.com.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things about this is not just a kind of typical horror comic, and there's a lot of those out there. And again, we looked at a lot of them last October, but this one actually, it's interesting in that the majority of it, at least so far, takes place on Halloween night itself. And so the story, the very notion of Halloween is not only in the title, but it's baked into the entire story. We're talking about one day, one adventure on that one day for the most part, or at least, again, so far. Yeah,
and I guess the entire first book, which is made up of 7 chapters, and I'm getting this information by going through the archive, the way that the information is organized here. I think everything in book 1 takes place on Halloween evening. Book 2, we're only, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 entries in, so there's really not enough there to give us much context. And in fact, we're dealing with some entirely different characters in Book 2, the most recent installments, than we were with everything going on in Book 1. Now, this has been around for, I think, about 3 years, and you and I were discussing this right before we started to record. It's a little difficult with this webcomic to determine when the installments were put up. And the reason I'm thinking that this began sometime in 2013, if you go to the very first page and you click on the comments, then the earliest comment seems to be from 3 years ago, and that's all the information we're given. We're not given a specific date. It just says a comment was up 3 years ago, so that would make it 2013.
Yeah. And this is, as we noted earlier, too, this is Abby Howard who's worked on this. And if you're familiar with her at all, you may recall that she was on the Strip Search reality show that Penny Arcade put on about 3 years ago. And she did very well in that show. She was, I think, got down to one of the finalists. And so as near as I could tell, this is like one of the first things she did after that show finished, because that ran from March through June of 2013. So this she must have started posting this shortly after that series wrapped up.
Well, that would make sense. Now, I'm not really familiar with Strip Search, but when you were watching this and she was on there, was she focusing on what eventually would become The Last Halloween?
No, actually. Well, the way the show was set up is they weren't really developing their comics on a kind of a show-to-show basis. The challenges and the tests and whatnot that were built into the show were a little bit more broad-based than that. So they were thinking not so much, and here's what I'm going to do as a comic strip afterwards, some burning story that I've got burbling for the past decade or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So as I recall, I don't recall her specifically. It certainly was not the focus of what she was doing during the show. I think it may have come up. She may have mentioned it towards the end because that. They get to the end of the show and then they start talking about, well, okay, so you didn't win, so what are you going to do, kind of thing. And as I don't recall specifically, that she said that, but it sounds like the type of thing that she would have said, okay, yeah, I've got this webcomic that I was kind of planning on doing, and it's about the Halloween and happening on Halloween. But I don't recall that they got into very much of that in the show itself.
Now, are you familiar with another comic of hers, which is Junior Scientist Power Hour?
I had seen it before. I did not read it in its entirety, though.
Okay, so there's that. And also, apparently, Abby Howard is a podcaster as well.
Again, one of those I'm aware that she's done a lot, and she's been in the business. And she kind of charged right after the Strip Search. I think was really kind of her big breakthrough debut, as it were. And she was one of the contestants, I think, who really stood out. One of the reasons that she did well is because she was so gung-ho about doing it, and not just, becoming a webcomic artist. There were some of the folks that seemed more along the lines of, hey, this sounds like a cool thing. I might try this and see how it goes. Or there were a couple of the younger contestants. No, they were all fairly young for the most part. Mm-hmm. But I think some of the really young contestants were more along the lines of, hey, I don't know what I want to do with the rest of my life. I know it wants to be in art somehow, and I kind of like comics, so this came along, and I thought it must be cool, that kind of thing. But I think Abby was one of the standouts of the show in that she really dove into it head first and really wanted to make her name as a webcomic artist, and that was her thing. She went in knowing that this is what I want to do. And I think there was a few other people like that. She wasn't the only one, certainly. Erica Moen probably is the most well-known of the contestants, right. She actually had something of a name for herself before she even got into the show. And there have been a couple of the other contestants that have done some other interesting things. But I think Abby, like I said, was one of the most gung-ho on the show in terms of interest in becoming a webcomic artist as a profession. Mm-hmm. And I think that shows in what she's done since then, right? So she's got Junior Scientist Power Hour. She's got The Last Halloween. She's got the podcast. She's doing all these things that are kind of all circling around becoming a professional webcomic artist. And I think she is at this point. I suspect that the majority of her income is actually webcomic based in some capacity.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of the nitty gritty of the webcomic The Last Halloween. I think that this is an interesting premise. And, you mentioned that, at least within this first book, everything takes place on Halloween night. And so, it sounds weird, right? We have a little over 100 pages in that first book, and it's just on that one night. It's funny because at first I thought that this would take place over a longer period of time, but then when you think about it, well, yeah, it does take place on that first evening. There's a lot packed into those 100-plus pages. So in that way, I think Howard decompresses time in ways that you usually don't find in comics. Or at least in an effective way, right? There's a lot of decompression going on, especially in mainstream comics. Mm-hmm. But, the more cynical side of me thinks, well, they do that for certain economic reasons. Who knows? But it definitely doesn't seem as if Howard is drawing out the story in book one, and because there's a lot going on. And the premise that we have, in essence, is that on Halloween night, there seems to have occurred a rupture between the world of humans and the world of monsters. Now, most humans didn't know that monsters existed, and there was a kind of dynamic, even at times symbiotic relationship between the humans and the monsters. And one of the things that kept that in check, that dynamic between the human and the monsters in check, was through a creature called the phagocyte. And what the phagocyte would do is to make sure that the monsters didn't intrude upon and attempt to destroy the world of the humans. And there's a reason why a monster would want to destroy a human. And we get this, and I can't remember where it is in the webcomic, but this bit of exposition takes place well into the narrative in book one. And we learned that for every monster, there is a corresponding human that it is attached to. And correct me if I'm misremembering this, but a monster's life basically ends when the human's life ends. However, if the monster ends up killing the human, then the monster can live on.
Not only live on, but become immortal.
Right.
In effect, yeah.
Yes. And so the reason we have this chaos is because the power of the phagocyte has dissipated, and we're not entirely sure why or who this character, the phagocyte, is. And that's what's causing this breakdown on Halloween night between the world of the humans and the world of the monsters, where the monsters are intent on destroying all humans. Right.
Basically, the phagocyte was keeping... As from the inferences that the phagocyte was actually going around and being very physically encountering these monsters and saying, you cannot kill this human or I will kill you, right? And he was being very authoritarian and very direct in terms of keeping the monsters in line, largely by the notion of fear, right? And he was going to destroy these monsters if they got out of line.
Right. Now, the main character in this story is a human girl by the name of Mona. And when we first see her, she's talking with her father, who, strangely enough, is cross-dressing in his his divorced wife. So she's not, no, she did die. That's right.
She did die, yes.
She killed herself. And he's dressed in her clothes because he still wants to be close to her. So anyway, Mona's talking to her father about it being Halloween. The father's getting ready to go out to a meeting. And then this is when we're introduced to Mona. Then she finds herself immersed in this world where the monsters are attacking the humans. And, of course, she's, the vast majority of this webcomic, she's just afraid, right? She doesn't know what's going on. She, is not up for fighting back or taking on the role of the journey that she assumes later. But she starts to meet others, and these aren't really monsters, well, at least from what we know at first, but they're undead, right? So the undead in this world tend to be at a kind of in-between place between human and monster. And so the undead characters that she meets and end up being her travel companions are this young vampire boy named Ringley, this weird creature dog thing that he calls Banjo. There is a really creepy doll by the name of Robert. There's a ghoul named Shirley, and then they eventually meet someone who looks like the Invisible Man, who is also a scientist by the name of Dr. Fugue. And so these become the main characters of The Last Halloween. And so when Mona, Ringley, and company get to Dr. Fugue's place, he sends them on a journey to actually seek out the phagocyte and gives Mona this kind of pickaxe weapon with eyes. And so I guess it's a sentient pickaxe in some way. And she ends up giving it a name. I can't remember what the name is, but...
Susanna, was it?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I think, yeah.
Which is not too different from the name of the monster that's attached to her that at first, they think that is there to kill her, but then she ends up becoming a dog-like pet.
Yeah, and I think she got named Susan, if I remember right.
So, if all of this setup that I've just described sounds a little strange, offbeat, weird, well, that's because that's the kind of comic this is.
Yeah, and I think what that actually leads to one of the interesting kind of thematic elements throughout the story is that even though that this is a horror comic, we're talking about undead and monsters, and it's on Halloween, it's actually quite funny, right? There's a lot of comedy based on the fact that we've got Mona going through this journey with these undead creatures, and she's battling monsters, which are very grotesque looking, I might add, a lot of them. But she just kind of stops and points out just how absurd some of this stuff is, and that's a lot of the comedy comes from the fact that she's witnessing this and going, no, this is stupid. Why is this happening? Stop that. That's bad. And it's that juxtaposition of her fear and terror of all these monsters and all the craziness that's going on all around her against her attitude of, yeah, that just doesn't even make sense. Why would you do that? The kind of a practical, almost level-headedness, I guess, between the two, floating back and forth between the two of them. I think that juxtaposition makes for a lot of the interesting comedy that comes out of this, and I think speaks a lot to Abby Howard's style of humor and sense of humor.
Right. So now the main storyline, includes all of those characters that I mentioned earlier. Your Mona and her gang, Wrigley, Banjo, Robert, Shirley, Dr. Fugue. But there are a couple of other storylines that are connected to Mona's story in several ways, and sometimes very thin ways, at least as of yet. Now, one of the earliest narrative threads we get is with a woman, and I don't know if we're ever given her name. I don't recall, but she's the one who has, I think I would call it more of a friend than a pet, Dogman. And when we first see this woman and Dogman, they have just blown up another character that we'll call Mr. Crispy, because I think that he's called Mr. Crispy at one point, who is burnt beyond recognition. And so this woman and Dogman are carrying this young man, and at first we don't know who he is. And then as book one develops, we get a sense of who this guy that they just kidnapped is. And this is an offspring of the phagocyte. In fact, we see an earlier offspring of the phagocyte, which we think is the only offspring. In fact, everybody thinks it's the only offspring until later the truth comes out that there was actually another offspring that seems to be poised to be the inheritor of the phagocyte's problems. or I'm sorry, the powers of the phagocyte. So that's one storyline. And toward the end of book 1, that does connect up with what's going on with Mona and company. Now, there's a third storyline that's going on, and this is one that involves a human doctor, a medical doctor. And when this creature that's been burned beyond recognition, Mr. Crispy, is brought to the hospital, this doctor is charged with seeing to him, or it, I guess. But monsters come in. And you can remember, this is Halloween night when the monsters first make their move. And they need the doctor. But we don't know exactly what role this human doctor is going to be playing in the story as a whole. And I think for a couple reasons. One, this narrative thread with the doctor and Mr. Crispy and the monsters in the hospital room is not really played out that much in book 1. I can see where it's going to be connected. If indeed, as I assume it is, Mr. Crispy is the phagocyte, then yeah, it's going to connect with the other stories, but that's not made entirely clear. And I think that's one reason why we don't get much information. We just don't see them much. And as a result, I think Howard doesn't make enough of a connection to the other story threads that are going on. And to me, that was, as much as I enjoyed The Last Halloween, that's its main drawback, is that at times I thought that Howard had too much going on that she was at least wanting to, if not attempting successfully, to bring together. And it seemed that these various narrative threads weren't tied off very neatly, at least in book 1.
Well, I think there's one of the more recent installments, though, is the woman who, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, is the person who's a companion with Dogman there.
Right.
She actually stops by that hospital to visit Mr. Crispy and talk with him.
Right. Oh, that's right. Yeah, toward the end of book 1. You're right.
It was either towards the end of book 1 or the very beginning of book 2. And starts to bring all of those pieces together. And so we do learn that Mr. Crispy is indeed the original phagocyte, and she deliberately did that to him to pull him out of the picture. There's some notion of kind of getting him away because he was so, I don't want to say just efficient, but he was kind of almost ruthless in his keeping that balance between the monsters and humans, to the point where a lot of monsters, including this woman, resented him, right? And he would like kill off their friends and their families and whatever, just by the nature of their being zombies or whatever. As I recall, I think there's even mention of that he was very bigoted towards the undead in general.
Right. Okay, and you're right. I mean, there is that connection toward the end of book 1 between what's going on in that hospital and the other storylines. However, I mean, why introduce this young doctor, the human doctor, into the story? Nothing much is made of her, at least at book 1. In subsequent books, perhaps more will be made with her. But I didn't think that enough time was spent fleshing her out. She seemed almost a tangential element, a prop for Mr. Crispy, who's actually the phagocyte. I don't know. That story thread didn't seem well developed to me, again, in book 1. And
I think
for that reason, things didn't seem tied up.
Well, I think we'll get more story purpose for that character later. I think so far the Doctor character has served mainly for to one point, to your point, kind of as a prop for the Mr. Crispy, but also as a reasonable point of exposition, right? So these monsters come down to visit Mr. Crispy and make sure that he's doing okay, and they're trying to help expedite his recovery as best they can. And then, so they're stuck in the hospital with the Doctor. And so they're able to sit down and explain all this stuff to the Doctor, and therefore also the reader. And that exposition would kind of seem forced, I think, if we didn't have someone like her, some human character that would be completely ignorant of the entire situation, that we can sit down and explain things to in a simple and straightforward fashion. So I don't know if that she served a character purpose necessarily yet, but she serves as a story purpose for allowing for that exposition to come off in a somewhat natural fashion, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I can definitely see that. But, there are other parts of The Last Halloween, again, in Book 1, that we're introduced to certain characters and potential storylines, and they're not fleshed out at least enough yet. For instance, the cross-dressing father, right, the widow. And then he connects up with Ringley's father, who is, a vampire, a male vampire. And they're at a support group that's trying to reach the dead, kind of like a medium. And yeah, we do get some information here about who these characters are and how they link to, Mona and the others in this story. I just get a sense that there's a lot going on here that perhaps, and maybe I'm off base, Abby Howard is kind of playing the story or mapping it out as she's going along, which to me makes sense in terms of a webcomic, right? Because we've talked about this on the show several times. There are some webcomic creators who go into this format, this way of storytelling, with a particular narrative trajectory in mind, right? And so every installment appears to adhere to that storyline. But then there are other webcomic creators whose stories kind of meander, but not in a negative way, right? They maybe explore certain characters or certain tangents of a particular storyline as it occurs to the creator, right? So what am I going to put up this week, or what am I going to put up today, or what's the next installment going to be? And I get a sense that this may be how Howard writes The Last Halloween, because at times she'll introduce characters and other storylines that may be important on down the line, but right now don't seem to fit very well, or she'll spend a little time with a character and what's going on with them and get into some exposition in a way that doesn't really function with what's going on with the story at that point. And again, all of this could be I don't know, better as a whole if we, look at the future finished webcomic. It's just a webcomic that's in process. It's going from one point to the next, kind of maybe moving one direction, then moving another one. And that's okay. Again, this being a webcomic. Now, if this were something that were print only, then I'd wonder about narrative direction. But I think that since webcomics are created in a very different context of other kind of storytelling in comics, print, then something like that, I'm not going to hold it against the artist.
Yeah, and I think that's there's an interesting way that she's actually just functionally putting the page together, right? And I think that speaks to that, right, is that she's looking at this very much as a webcomic. And if you go through and start reading, start at page 1 and kind of flip through, what's interesting is that each installment is not necessarily a formatted 8.5 by 11 or whatever type of page or a strip format, like a newspaper strip or something. It's very much flows with flows out of her storytelling itself, right? So we might have one installment that has just a handful of panels, and we might have the next installment might be 30 or 40 panels, and they don't seem to fit any kind of regular pattern in terms of that type of format that you would expect on a typical printed comic, regardless of size or format or whatever, right? And the individual panels as well. They don't necessarily align in a way that you would necessarily, in the same way that you would align them if you were doing a print comic where you've got the boundaries of the page limiting how much information you can put on any given page. So I think that the format of the comic itself speaks also to the fact that Howard is looking at this very much as a webcomic specifically, and not, here I'm going to do this print comic and just put it online and maybe sell some copies later or something like that. Right.
Now, format-wise, that's something I definitely enjoyed and appreciated when it comes to The Last Halloween is I like the way that when she puts up an installment, it's not just, a digital version of a printed page. In other words, in looking at The Last Halloween, it reminded me actually of the kind of webcomics we see coming out of Study Group, right? Where it is a scroll down format instead of a page-by-page format. And the way that they do it with Study Group is that whenever there's an update, they just add however many panels to the page that they already have up. And so as that particular chapter develops, you keep scrolling down further and further and further as time goes on. It's slightly different, though, with The Last Halloween. It's that every installment, and I think it, if I remember correctly, it's supposed to go up every Thursday normally, that every installment is one long page that you have to scroll down. So, I'd be curious to see how she reformats the panel layout in the printed book form, because I don't know if it's available yet, but I know that she does have in the works a printed book 1 of The Last Halloween.
Yeah, because I would think that would require some substantial redesign on her part,
right.
Unless she's got some kind of plan that she's kind of invisible behind the scenes method of working. And I've seen a few cartoonists do that before, although it's a little more obvious in some capacity, and I don't see that obviousness here, which is not necessarily, she might have a plan and I'm just not seeing it, and that might be perfectly simple and easy for her to do. More power to her if she can pull it off easily.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned earlier that Book 2 has started relatively recently. And again, we don't have dates on the pages, and so I don't know when the first page of Book 2 went up, but so far we have 5 installments in Book 2, and we're given entirely new characters that we haven't seen before. So, as I mentioned earlier, she's really good at introducing new characters and new storylines. This one seems to be one that she's going to flesh out for quite a while. We're introduced to some monsters and 2 humans, Libby and Malcolm. And Libby and Malcolm are kids, and they're spying on the monsters, and they're kind of wreaking havoc with the monsters. So, and that's how Book 2 begins, but we're not that far enough into it to know what's going on or how exactly this is going to connect up to the story with Mona and her friends. Although it's going to, because this is still taking place around the time of that big split between the monsters and the humans.
Right. And she actually just started this back up, or at least according to, she did a comic between her Book 1 and Book 2 that basically says, hey, I'm finished up with Book 1. I'm going to take a little bit of a break here while I work on this. She had a Kickstarter going for a while. And I'll see you in October of 2016 when I restart Book 2.
So I guess it just restarted recently.
Yeah, I think it just, and I seem to recall seeing a tweet or a Facebook post or something recently from her that she just started adding new pages a week or 2 ago.
Okay.
So it's been very recent, I think.
So good timing on our part that we discussed this one in October.
We absolutely planned that well in advance. and yeah.
Well, Sean, you want to move to the next webcomic that we're looking at this month?
Yeah. Take a look at Urbanity Planet.
And this is by Theora Kvitka, and if that name sounds familiar, that's because Theora has been on the Comics Alternative a couple of times. I met Theora last year at Small Press Expo and talked with her briefly for the podcast while I was at that SPX. And then last month, when I went back up to SPX, I talked with her briefly again for the podcast. And in fact, it was this year that she ended up telling me about a new webcomic that she just started called Urbanity Planet. And then you and I were thinking, well, maybe we can discuss this for October because we would be getting it in its early days. And this is definitely early. The first page of Urbanity Planet went up on February 29th of this year. Now, you can find Urbanity Planet at not one, but actually two locations. One is on Tumblr, and that's urbanityplanet.tumblr.com. And then another one is at the website medium.com. So that's medium.com/Urbanity Planet. Now, Sean, how did you read Urbanity Planet? On Tumblr or on Medium?
I've tried reading it through Tumblr, and I have to say that was a little bit of a challenge. Tumblr is definitely not the prime experience for reading a webcomic, I don't think. Certainly doable, but the inherent navigation doesn't necessarily lend itself to a webcomic format, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. But, we've looked at other webcomics on Tumblr before, and there are a lot of people who do their webcomics through Tumblr. So it's possible. Now, one of the things, and this gets back to the aforementioned design issue that you and I bring up quite frequently on this webcomic series, there's something about the way that Kvitka's Tumblr site is set up, and she tells us on the very first page. So if you click on Start Here, then at the bottom of that first installment, she says, to continue reading chronologically through the rest of the webcomic, please click the previous post link at the bottom of the page. And I skipped over that at first, and I thought I would click next post because that would make sense, right?
Right.
Previous post, why would I do that? Then I read her instructions, and at clicking the previous post got you to the next post, which doesn't make sense to me. And so that's a design issue that I think Theora would probably need to work on. And when I was talking with her at Small Press Expo last month, off mic, we were talking over breakfast time. She and I were talking about issues of design in webcomics, and that's something that she hadn't really thought a lot about and doesn't have much experience in, but it's something that she's interested in learning more about. I mean, how do you visually lay out a webcomic in ways that's going to make it conducive to the kind of storytelling you want to do and make it engaging and useful for your reader, like in terms of an archive or about page and things, a comment section, things of that sort. A way for you to connect to and hold on to your audience.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a tried and true method for this type of thing, at least theoretically, is that you go out and you find webcomics that you already like, right? Whether that's just because of the story, whether it's because of the art, whether it's because of the characters, whatever. Find the ones that really appeal to you the most and read through them as a reader. And find out what works and what doesn't in that. Do you have trouble going back and forth between installments? Do you have trouble picking up where you left off, a week ago? Do you have trouble finding a forward and back button or knowing who the characters are or whatever? Find the stuff that somebody else has already done and has already worked on and steal it. Mm-hmm. That's basically what it amounts to. And, that's a lot of, and you and I were talking a little bit about this offline earlier too, is a lot of what is kind of a standard practice for webcomics. Our standard practice is because everybody was stealing from each other, right? As 20 years ago when webcomics were still pretty new, people were trying stuff out. They didn't know if this worked. They didn't know if that worked. They do something. It may or may not work. But the things that did work, other people would see and say, hey, that looks good. That works well. Let me use that. And that may have just been a forward and back button. That may have been an archive. That may have been a cast page, whatever. But somebody did something that stuck and other people started copying the idea. And I think that's the best approach, really, is that you look at the comics that seem to stand out. And you don't want to necessarily try and swipe their characters. You don't want to swipe their story, right? They're already doing that. You need to tell your own story, but you can swipe the elements that do work very well, right? So you can swipe that forward and back button. You can swipe that the navigation concept that they've got already in place. And I think that's gonna there's a bit of a challenge, obviously, is then implementing it on your site. And, if you're not technically savvy, that might be another challenge. But the other option with that, too, is that a lot of these webcomics folks, they've been there. They've done this. They had the same problems when they started, and they got help from somebody. And most of the time, they're going to be pretty friendly about helping you out.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to do the work for you, certainly. But if you ask them, hey, how did you set up that archive? How did you set up that form for contacting you or whatever? How did you go about doing this? And they'll tell you 9 times out of 10. They'll just say, yeah, okay, I just grabbed that from this other thing here. Or, oh, that's a simple JavaScript. Here's the code for it.
Right.
Or whatever.
Now, like you, I read Urbanity Planet on Tumblr, and even with the aforementioned problem of the previous post issue, I do think that that's an easier way of consuming Urbanity Planet than going to the medium.com site. And I'm not really familiar with medium.com, but in looking at her page on medium.com, and again, that's medium.com/the @Urbanity Planet, what you in essence have is a blog page, and that's it. So as you scroll down, you see a link to each of the pages that and even postings, not just pages to the webcomic, but comments like in the about page that she's put in. So we see those entries there, and in order to read a particular page, you click on the entry, and it gives you, I guess, the full window image. It's a little more awkward than Tumblr. So in reading Urbanity Planet, I think that Tumblr is the better way of going. Now, we've been talking about Urbanity Planet in terms of its design online, but we haven't really talked about the content, what this webcomic is about. So how would you describe Urbanity Planet?
It's basically, it's a science fiction tale, and it starts off with the premise that something more or less contemporaneous to us, maybe a little bit in the future. Earth basically just gets too expensive for most people. It's just the prices of everything have skyrocketed to the point where it's almost impossible to earn an actual living on planet Earth. And so people are then essentially taking off, leaving the planet, going other places to try and make a living elsewhere. The challenge, the problem with that is that obviously you're moving to a place you're not familiar with. That's got its own culture kind of built up, although it's all we've seen so far are still just humans. We haven't seen yet like any alien life forms that we're dealing with or anything like that. But there's still a culture that develops around on these other planets.
Well, there are aliens, though.
Have we seen aliens? I don't recall aliens.
Yeah, they're the ones who have what look like the really long earlobes. They're humanoid.
Oh, yes.
But they're the ones who like work in or maybe even own some of the businesses on this planet of, and I'm not sure how we would pronounce this name, but it's Ultron. It's N!!ULTON. So that's the name of this planet. So I guess these creatures with the long droopy earlobes are from this planet. So yeah, we do see these aliens, but not often, and they don't play a major role, at least in the story so far.
Yeah. That must be why I forgot about them. Yes, I do remember that now that you mention them.
Yeah, and what you just mentioned in terms of the setup, that's what this is all about. And Theora writes on her about page, I just saw, she asked this question, which I think is a great setup of what this webcomic is about. What would happen if the cost of living on Earth became so high that recent college grads couldn't afford to live there anymore? They'd pack up their spaceships and move to planet Again, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Alton, of course. And so that's what we have going on. As you were describing the dilemma of the young people, young college grads in Urbanity Planet, I couldn't help but think of Wall-E, that the planet becomes so bad that people leave it. But for that, it was through environmental reasons. Here, it's economic deprivation, I guess, that a lot of these younger people, recent college grads, leave because there's really nothing economically left there for them on Earth. And this is a really interesting premise, and it makes sense to me in light of my most recent conversation with Theora when I saw her last month at SPX. Because, before she got into telling me about Urbanity Planet, she was telling me about what's been going on with her over the past year. Recently graduated from school, made moves, and now is trying to, find steady work. And so she personally, the creator, Theora Kvitka, is in a similar situation as the characters she writes about in Urbanity Planet. Now, these young people who have moved to another planet to try to find work, they're called shipsters.
Because they got on a ship.
And they're right. But also there's something about hipster there as well. Because some of these actually look like, hipster kind of characters. Now, the main person we have in this story is a woman by the name of Dani, D-A-N-I. And so she's someone who leaves Earth. She was going to move to this other planet because she had a roommate there, but then the roommate ended up finding pretty good employment back on Earth. And so Dani goes to this other planet by herself and is trying to set up a life. But then there are other characters on the planet Alton as well. There's a couple, kind of a shipster couple named Robert and Becky. There is a blogger who thinks that everything he does is all serious, and he's a serious journalist. His name is Milton, and then Milton, I guess this is his roommate, is another young person named Catherine, and she's looking for work as well. And I think she finds work as a barista, doesn't she?
Yeah, but it was very part-time, as I recall, like only 2 hours a day
part-time,
or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we have all these characters, all these young characters who've recently graduated from school, who go to the planet Alton and are trying to get by. And we don't have but just a few months of Urbanity Planet to go by here. I mean, this is a very young, very fresh webcomic, but what it seems to me is that this is going to be an episodic narrative, not really a gag strip or a done-in-one, right, where every single panel is just, one and off, dilemma, situation, gag, or what have you. There are going to be some ongoing storylines, but it just strikes me that the nature of Urbanity Planet is one to where each installment is going to be self-contained, and you don't necessarily need to read everything that came before to appreciate the most recent posting.
I would largely agree with that, although I think that the context of the previous installments does color the current ones. So if you don't go through, I think you can drop in wherever and start reading and not have too much difficulty. But I think there's definitely a more textured and layered approach to your reading if you do have those other backstory elements to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, this is something that, I mentioned just a second ago that we're at the early stages of Urbanity Planet, and this is Theora's first webcomic, so I'm wondering how Urbanity Planet will evolve in the coming months, right? So we may see not just the content of the story develop, obviously, but the way that she tells the story could change as she's learning more about creating comics for online consumption.
Yeah, I think that's definitely it will be an interesting thing to watch evolve. Mm-hmm. And what I also like about this too is that Kvitka is essentially living this life. I mean, the metaphor of the overall story is pretty obvious, right? Right. That's and the fact that Kvitka is currently living in this very situation, right, feeling alienated from a large part of society because she can't get this, the full-time employment that she's looking for. I think there's a I don't know, an immediateness to it, a realness to it that you might not get with someone, even, like say Abby Howard, or someone of her ilk who is maybe just a few years older and, a little bit more established. I think Kvitka's, just by the nature of her position, there's a truth, I guess, to this comic that you don't see elsewhere, right? You don't see it. You can read the think pieces in the Washington Post or whatever, but this is what's going on in her day-to-day life, essentially, right?
Right. And if she also, around the time that she was starting Urbanity Planet, she moved herself, and I believe she moved to Pittsburgh, if I remember correctly. So it could be this other planet experience is very much like what we're finding in Theora's own life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's and that's one of the things I'll be interested in seeing is, I'm 44 years old, right? I went through college and I did my had the challenges of getting my first job out of school and whatever. But that was, 20 years ago at this point. And I recognize that the situation is very different now, but I'm not living it. So I think I get a lot more out of it and seeing that kind of directness, like I said, that kind of truth that's coming directly from the source almost, as opposed to, again, I can read as many think pieces as I want on the Washington Post or wherever, but I think there's that connection. I think is a little more visceral reading through Kvitka's comic here.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd mentioned that, she's new to webcomics, but she's not brand new to comics. She has other works out, so if you ever see her at conventions, you may want to gobble some of these up. I think one of her more recent books is called Commuter Naps, but she's also done a couple of mini comics. One's called It's Happening, and then It's Still Happening. So you can check her out if you're lucky enough to see her. And she is a wonderful person, very, very friendly, very fun to talk with. But you can check out her website, theorakvitka.com. But Urbanity Planet, you can find one of other two places, urbanityplanet.tumblr.com or medium.com/@urbanityplanet. Well, Sean, last month we started something brand new on the monthly webcomic series, and that is checking in with a couple of creators, Jim McClain and Paul Schultz. They are at the very, very early stages of a new webcomic called Poe and the Mysteriads. And last month was the inaugural episode where we began talking with them. And just to remind our listeners, we wanted every month to check in with Jim and Paul and to see where they are in the setup, the creation, the design, the storytelling of this webcomic they have an idea for, Poe and the Mysteriads.
Yeah, and so we sat down again with them last week and chatted a bit and just see what kind of progress they had made in the past month. And I think Jim got thrown under the bus pretty heavily. But that's part of the nature of developing a webcomic, and that one of the reasons why I know I certainly was interested in having these kind of discussions is because most of the time I think most people just see the finished product and assume it kind of came to fruition ready-made, and that's very much not the case. And so we'll sit down, we'll talk with Jim and Paul every month and find out their progress on everything they're doing before the comic even goes live, before anybody actually sees it.
Okay, well, let's listen to our conversation with them that we had a couple of days ago. So,
Jim, Paul, welcome back. we're here to check in and see how things are going. So what's the update on Poe and the Mysteriads these days?
Well, thanks for having us back.
Mm-hmm.
We've made a significant amount of progress. We have our cover. We had page 2 originally, and that was the thing that inspired us to really move on. And now page 1 and page 3 are complete, and so we have 3 full pages and our cover all set to go. And so we're basically making steady progress. Paul had to wait for me a little bit because I got caught up in stuff and didn't realize that he was waiting for me to send him a script. It was like 2 weeks had passed, and it's like, he goes, "Yeah, we're going to do that page." It's like, "Oh, were you done?" Oh, whoops.
If that's how you read that message, I'm sorry.
Well, I didn't realize that he had finished his pages, and I'm just like, I was just waiting for him to finish. It's like, "Oh, you're done. Okay, I guess it's my turn." So we hadn't seen each other in Paul, 2 months, something like that.
It's been about 2 months, yeah.
Yeah, because my mother passed away in August, and so I was dealing with that, and I'm still dealing with her estate and stuff. It's like, you want to know the real life part of making a comic? You introduce the death of a parent. That'll put you on the rails for a minute. And so I've been working on that and dealing with that, and so I kind of fell behind and didn't get over to LaPorte to see Paul. Once again, it's a 50-minute drive to get over there, and so I finally did get over there on Sunday, and so we sat down, had a little dinner, and worked out what we're going to do for the next several dozen pages. So we're back on track. We did make progress over the month for sure, just not as much as we probably could have if I'd realized that he was waiting for me.
It's one thing to do this, over the internet and whatnot, which we've done since day one, but to actually sit down and go over stuff, physically, it's, that's when you really feel like you're really going somewhere with it. So.
Well, how often does that happen where you guys physically sit down?
In the summertime, it was happening, once a week, wasn't it? We were meeting on Mondays.
Yeah.
We were meeting on Mondays and sitting down at a cool restaurant in LaPorte that had just opened, and it's like it was brand new. We were virtually the only ones sitting there, so it was like having this whole place to ourselves. It was fantastic.
It was nice. It was like a Godfather kind of a thing.
Yeah, definitely. And so we made a lot of progress that way, and that was where the bulk of the story came together. And then we just basically go back and forth. Paul gets. We're working Marvel style, so I give him the essence of a plot with some breakdowns. I can draw too, but just not as well as he does. And then he does the full page, and then I go back and do the script over it. And then it's basically a really good synergy that way, because we even used that word the other day. Yeah. It's a good synergy because the give and take is creating something more than we would have created individually. An example where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Exactly.
So so then you've got. It sounds like then when the last time you guys got together, you kind of had a larger, longer outline of what you're shooting for with the story. Then or is that not a full script? Then obviously, if you're working Marvel style, but you got kind of a plot delineated for the next 2 dozen pages, something like that.
Oh heck no!
Okay.
Well, we did come up with some pretty good chunks of the plot. Yeah. So we got that going on, but we, as he said, no.
we weren't even sure how many pages that we were going to do when we spoke to you guys last. We were like, "Hey, Paul, what do you think? 48, 64, something?" Yeah, sounds good. And pretty much now when we sat down, wow, was that only yesterday, Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Time flies. Well, my days at work seem really long. Sorry. Could have been 2 days. So when we sat down yesterday, we were taking a look at Todd DeZago and Craig Russo's Perhapanauts hardcover that I backed on Kickstarter. And it was a nice little hardcover, and it's 64 pages. And I talked to Craig about how much it cost and where he had it printed and everything like that. And when I found that out, I said, no, we need to do 64. We can put this in a hardcover. It's going to rock. And so we basically didn't have a set number of pages until yesterday. So now we're pretty much sure we're doing 64 pages.
I have that Perhapanauts book as well, actually, and if I recall correctly, it's actually kind of structured more like a traditional pamphlet comic, right? With the chapter breaks, which would be every 22, 23 pages or thereabouts. So are you following that format, or are you still doing basically one large story for the 64 pages?
No, we're doing one large story. It's got 3 acts like a normal script. But the thing I liked about the Perhapanauts book especially was that some of the pages are in landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would go from portrait, and then all of a sudden landscape, and it's a little bit jarring, but it was still readable. I'm like, okay, finally somebody did this who actually is known, and it looks good. It would be accepted, I think, if we did it that way.
Yeah, so landscape is sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, landscape is offering up a whole new bunch of challenges for me visually, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's just allowing me to approach it from a different angle, literally, and so that's the challenge of it is what's making it really. Working with Jim is like working with myself right now because he's never came up with a bad idea yet, but it's like so I just let him run. That's what he does, and he's great at it. But I'm looking at it from a visual point of view and from the artistic point of view, and being able to turn it on its ear and do it landscape style allows me to like I've never done it really, so I want to do it the best I can. So it seems doing it that way seems to really be making it look, it's like the best stuff I've done, I think. So
oh, definitely, it definitely is.
That's interesting in that. You're talking about looking at the Perhapanauts and getting ideas about layout and design. One of the things I found with many webcomics is that those that make their way eventually to print use the landscape format, I guess, because of the nature of the screen and how you lay it out. I mean, obviously, I think there are even more webcomic creators who use more of a traditional page size for a webcomic, and then that would translate into a book. But for those who use landscape, then obviously the print edition would look and feel quite a bit different, which I think would have some pluses and minuses as well. So is this something that you're keeping in mind maybe for, the future consideration, that maybe the landscape would be good for you when you actually do get to the point that you're ready for print?
Well, yeah, and the thing is, between us, we have a number of books that have been done this way. And so looking at it in the perspective of what has gone before, I'll give you an example. When I was in San Diego this summer, I met the young lady who draws the Disney Princesses book. And the Disney Princesses comic is done in landscape format, but then she told me that for the trade, they're going to go to portrait, which is basically they're going to stack 2 landscape pages over one another.
Oh, okay.
And that's also how they did Adventures of Superman for DC. The Web First book, Batman 66 was done the same way. And Sensation, all of DC's digital first were done landscape format, and then they were cheated to put back in portrait. I want us to stay with landscape because I think it actually looks really cool, and it works better for this book.
Yeah, definitely.
And we do know some people who've done it that way, and it's just gonna we really have nothing to lose at this point. We're invested in this with nothing but time, and we're going to crowdfund it. And so we're not investing large sums of money. So what's wrong with experimenting?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what's the next step then for you guys? Are you gonna essentially try to keep working on the script and keep moving forward and getting art pages together and just seeing how much you can get done over the next month or 2 or 3? Is that it? Or is there other stuff you're starting to look at too? Like you mentioned, talking about, actual production and some of the costs in that. Are you doing more investigative work along those lines as well?
No, that stuff's easy. I shouldn't have said it quite so not humbly. I don't know. I shouldn't have said it so immodestly. I've been smack in the middle of doing that for my Solution Squad book for the last 3 years, so I know how to do that already. The struggle is the creative part right now. It's like with New York Comic Con coming up, I'll be in New York for a week, and that took a big chunk out of my time. But no, coming up with the long story, we pretty much worked all that out yesterday. Honestly, we still haven't even come up with some of the characters who are the Mysteriads in the title of the book.
Right.
So,
Yeah, because we could have like worked everything out before like any of the pages were even done, but we kind of are working at creating as we go. So that to me makes it exciting. So that's what I'm focusing on primarily, is just the visual aspect of it and what the characters look like and how it's going to flow artistically. So that's my long-term plan while he does all the heavy work.
Okay.
I wouldn't even call it that. You trust me, he spends way more time on drawing the pages than I do on writing them.
So when Sean and I check in with you guys in November, what should we ask you? Or another way of putting this is, in what way should we hold your feet to the fire?
Well, we should have at least 4 more pages done, I would think.
Okay.
Knock on wood, yes.
Okay.
I mean, the thing is, we're going to launch in January, and so if we can do a page a week from here till the end of the year, we have 3 more months, so that's 12 more weeks, and we already have 3 in the book. So we should be 15. We should be 15 pages in before we even launch on the web.
Right.
Okay. Good.
So that's a pretty decent buffer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we will check back with you in another month and see how things go with those additional pages, as well as what kind of interest you were able to generate in New York.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Jim and Paul, thanks a lot for being on the show, and we will talk with you in November.
Okay, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So it's great to get an update from Paul and Jim, and this is going to be an interesting project, month-by-month updates on the creation of Poe and the Mysteriads.
Yeah, and I'm really I really like what I've seen so far, and I'm looking forward to seeing as they develop this.
Right, and we will put the new art that they had mentioned up in our show notes.
Great.
Well, Sean, let's move on to the last title that we're going to be looking at this month, and this is an already completed webcomic, Odysseus the Rebel. This is by Stephen Grant and Scott Bieser. Is it Bieser or Bieser?
I think it's Bieser, but I'm not positive.
Bieser.
Yeah.
Yes, and you can find this at their website, Big Head Press. That's one word, bigheadpress.com. And Big Head Press is actually the press that put up a trade paperback of this book a few years ago. Now, this is an older webcomic. I'm not entirely sure exactly when it started and exactly when it ended, but by going from the copyright information on the site, it looks like this was something that they had going on between 2003 and 2009.
Yeah, this is one that I found. It was one of the early serials that I started reading, and I was reading it as it was coming out originally, and so yeah, I mean it was, I want to say it was somewhere around 2003, 2004 when I first discovered it, and it was already at least a little bit into the story at that point. So this one goes back a little ways. Mm-hmm.
And as the title suggests, this does deal with the classic mythic Homeric figure of Odysseus. And so we get parts of his story in this webcomic. And I think this is a long webcomic, but it's not what I would call a debilitatingly long webcomic. Right? So it's one that once you commit to, you're not going to be spending the next several years, once it's the completed comic, I guess, reading everything, because I think it's a well-developed story. We get a lot packed into it. There are many different installments, but it's not a webcomic that when I looked at at everything, I thought, oh my God, this is going to take me forever to read. It takes time, but again, it's not intimidating.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a lot to Grant and Bieser's just work as professionals, right? These are guys who were doing comics before webcomics were even a thing, and so they were able to bring that experience to Odysseus here, so that when they're telling the story, they're telling you they're telling you that story, and they're not wandering around trying to figure out how to write this or how to draw that or how this should play out. They had this. This is very much a professional webcomic or professional comic period in that sense, I think.
Now, have you looked at the print version of Odysseus the Rebel?
No, I've never seen the printed copy of this.
Yeah, I haven't either. But it looks like the book, according to the website, is 184 pages. Mm-hmm. And, it even has a Diamond order number. So they offered it through Diamond as well. But I guess you can find it on Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles. I guess you could even order it directly from these guys in paying through PayPal. Yeah.
It's one of the interesting things is that it was, I don't know. I can almost guarantee it wasn't the first webcomic that kind of leapt back to print like that. But it was one of the earlier ones, I think. And I think they were one of the earlier champions of, hey, we'll put this out there. We'll put this as a free webcomic and then sell it as a trade paperback later. That kind of approach. I think they were one of the earlier proponents of that. I think that was their game from jump, back in 2003. That was the whole plan.
Right. And although, you could get the book if you wanted, and it apparently is still in print because you can still get it through Amazon, they have made the online version still available. So that's good. And I know that, and we've even talked with some creators on the Comics Alternative in the past, that they may start a narrative as a webcomic and then truncate their story and finish it up in print, or they may have everything completed online, but yet when their story makes it to print, then they only put a small amount, maybe the first chapter of it, to kind of tease the reader to then go buy the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that speaks to the fact that these were one of the earlier guys promoting that approach of doing the webcomic and then printing it. Is Big Head Press is basically them. I think. Right. It's essentially self-publishing, and because this is we're talking 2003. This is before Kickstarter. This is before. A lot of print-on-demand stuff was even available, right? So I think that this was developed with the sense that, hey, we're going to publish this as basically a traditional indie, quote, if traditional indie is really a thing, but kind of a traditional indie approach in that here it is, here's our comic, you buy it off our, from our table or whatever. And they're using the webcomic as the kind of the sales pitch version of it. So they're not going through, I think a lot of the other folks that we've seen that end up truncating the webcomic version to a single chapter or a short preview are those who are going through a more traditional publisher, right. An Oni Press or a Dark Horse or whoever. And so the publisher comes back and says, hey, we don't want to cannibalize sales or whatever. And I don't think they're really worried about that here because they've kind of, at the time, at least, it was very new virgin territory for, as webcomics just did not make the leap to print publication that way, and certainly not at a large publisher level, right? No one was getting signed by Dark Horse or Oni or First Second or any of those guys because they did a really cool webcomic. That just did not happen back then.
Right. Now, I guess it all depends on the publisher because, and again, this maybe gets us a little further from Odysseus the Rebel than we want to at this point, but because we do need to talk about the webcomic. But there's some publishers that I think once they publish print versions of the webcomic is still there. And I'm thinking specifically of Image and Dark Horse because they've been doing a lot, especially Dark Horse has been doing a lot of that over the past year or two, taking webcomics and then begin publishing them in print. But yet the webcomic is still available. For instance, last month's Kill 6 Billion Demons and the Space Mullet is another one that you can still find online. But then other publishers, and I'm thinking of, let's say, major trade publishers like HarperCollins and First Second, I don't. It may be something contractual with them that the web creator has to take down, if not all, then most of the webcomic before they would publish that. And I know just recently we interviewed Jason Shiga on the Comics Alternative because the first book of the Demon webcomic was released, and he mentioned that the first chapter is still available online, but he didn't say that First Second asked him to take it down, but he said he took it down. So I don't know if that was something that he was, contractually obligated to do or what. But I guess with some publishers like First Second, HarperCollins, and others, if it's a webcomic, it can't be completely available online when the book is published. Yet with other publishers like Dark Horse and Image, that's not necessarily going to be the case.
Right. But if you remember, we go back to something like Delilah Dirk, which we talked about a few months ago. Tony Cliff specifically told, I forget, me or us or somewhere, he mentioned specifically that was part of his contract, that once the book was published, he had to remove everything but the first chapter from his site. So that's a clear example where we have concrete evidence that actually does happen, and that is getting written into the contracts that they have to pull that down.
Yeah, and in fact, he told me and Gwen Tarbox when we interviewed him back in April that was the case.
Yeah.
So, but getting back to, I guess, the detail of Odysseus the Rebel, and I made that little slip, Ulysses, because this is another adaptation that we're dealing with, right? A couple of months ago or so, 2 or 3 months ago, we looked at Ulysses' scene, and then now we're looking at another adaptation, Odysseus the Rebel.
Yeah, and this is we kind of alluded to it earlier. It's an adaptation of Homer's Odyssey, the old Greek classic of Odysseus. He went to the Battle of Troy. Fought there for 10 years, and then on his way home kind of got sidetracked for another 10 years.
Right. Right. And so that's part of this story. And in fact, this story begins, I guess, not long after the 10-Year War. And we get a kind of a condensation of everything that goes on with Odysseus during that 10 years. But we do see, either as part of the story or alluded to, many of the highlights that you would find in Homer's Odyssey.
Mm-hmm. And that's I think that was an interesting challenge just from the standpoint of, similar to Ulysses, since we already brought that up, it's a long story, the original, right? There's a lot of content there to deal with. So how do you adapt that into a comics form without taking up several phone books of space, even if you're doing it on a webcomic, right? Functionally that would take years and years to to draw through and whatever. So basically what they've done is they've condensed the story, and a lot of the kind of these side trips and side adventures that Odysseus has on his trip home just get this kind of an allusion or a brief passing to. We may have a page or two reference or a flashback or something to, the scene with the Cyclops, I think that gets pulled down to, I think, maybe 2 pages or something like that, right?
Yeah, at most.
It's a lot of scenes are very quickly truncated like that. And I think that's a lot of the professional storytelling that I talked about earlier, right? Is these guys are basically trying to get to the meat of the story itself. And there's a lot of action and adventure you can talk about. And, there's, the fight with the Cyclops and the, various mermaids and other monsters and gods and whatnot. And a lot of that goes on for a long time. And a lot of it's interesting because you've got this action-packed stuff and battles and all the fun and excitement that comes with that. But that's not really the story that they're trying to tell, right? They're trying.
Right. The story for Grant and Bieser that is so significant is actually embedded in the title itself, Odysseus the Rebel. It is between Odysseus and the gods, and specifically Odysseus and Poseidon. And it's this tension between Odysseus and the gods that really drives this story. And that's what Grant and Bieser are so interested in and this is in Homer's Odyssey, of course, but I think that Grant and Bieser really bring it to the fore in a much more noticeable way. This kind of, let's say, Promethean side, if we want to call it that, of Odysseus, right? That he will go against the gods regardless of the costs. In other words, he does have human pride, and he's gonna do what he needs to do, and he's not going to be a pawn of Poseidon or the others. And fairly early on in this webcomic, I think we're into like maybe about the 4th or 5th page, we do get the first encounter between Odysseus and Poseidon, and this basically sets the tone of everything that you of Odysseus will do in his relationship with the gods throughout the rest of this webcomic.
Yeah, and I think it ends up bookending nicely too, because we get that set up, like you said, it was a few pages into it, and then at the very end, that's basically the conclusion, right? Is Odysseus standing there yelling at Poseidon once again, and telling him to, I think he literally says to go fuck yourself. Excuse me, if we do we need to bleep that? But yeah, so it's a bookend piece on that, right? Is that's the setup. You know that from the very beginning. We have these little, we have some of those side adventures, like I said, throughout the body of the story itself. But peppered with this thematic notion of going against the gods and going against what they're trying to do and say and get him to do and say. And then we end up at the very end with a final big middle finger to the gods themselves.
Right. And this is also something that is embedded in Homer's narrative, but Grant and Bieser really bring it out much more so in this webcomic, I think. And that is the role of artists in the story of Odysseus. Because one of the things that the gods say throughout that is, Odysseus, like all humans, is basically to our whim, and he can rebel all he wants, but in the end, who are the ones who are going to be remembered? Who are the ones who are going to have the real power? But what we see as this webcomic unfolds is that, Odysseus becomes the subject of legend as he is journeying back, as he is trying to get back home. And so his presence becomes much more powerful through storytelling than the actual experiences and adventures he has himself. In other words, his power is in his story being told. And so at the end, when the gods are saying that, people will not remember him. He's had his moment of rebellion, but he'll just fade out, and no one will even know who he ever was. Well, we know otherwise, and the reason why we know about him, and he's much more significant than the gods that he's fighting against, is because his story is told, because of creators like Homer, whoever or whatever Homer was, and people continuing to tell the story of the Odyssey, such as webcomic creators Stephen Grant and Scott Bieser.
Mm-hmm. And what I like about this too is, the kind of going along that same thing. We're telling this story, right? Homer told this story once eons ago. It's been told many times since then in various forms and various factions. And one of the things that I like is in this particular version is that they've essentially, even though they've still got it set within, the surrounding the Battle of Troy and, all that time period, it has a much more contemporaneous feel to it. A lot, I think, because of the language itself, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There's a lot of very contemporary sounding language, and it doesn't even try to, provide this kind of faux ancient Greek that you might find in like a Stan Lee Marvel comic, right? Like he would try and fudge stuff and do this, Shakespearean sounding gobbledygook just to kind of emphasize that the characters are a little different or whatever. Yeah. There's none of that here. It's very much a contemporary language throughout that's very that's I think speaks to the reader in a way that you would not get in a simple translation of Homer.
Right. As an example, a page that I'm looking on, which is when we first see Poseidon, is when the two meet for the first time in this webcomic. Poseidon says to Odysseus, "Accept at last what a vile little piece of shit you are." And so definitely not Shakespearean language.
No, not so much.
And that's one of the things I very much appreciate about Odysseus the Rebel is that both Grant and Bieser present their story in such a way that it's the language we speak. It's very contemporary to our form of speech as well as storytelling, right? So I think that they're adapting the Odyssey in a way that many things should be adapted, right? Not so much to pay reverence to the original, but to make it something new and to make it more contemporary, depending on your audience.
Yeah, and it goes to that whole theme that Odysseus is trying to get across here is that humanity is going to keep telling his story, and they're going to tell it in their own way. They're going to adapt to it. Even when he first returns to Ithaca, he's bombarded with, we heard about this adventure or that adventure, and he's going, what? No, that never happened. What are you guys talking about? And he kind of makes the recognition that, that a lot of people are making up these stories about him already, even during his lifetime. Mm-hmm. And that contemporary language that they're using, that contemporary storytelling that they're using, I think speaks to that in another way, is that, hey, we're still telling a story, and we're still telling the story that we kind of want and need to hear, right? As the stories that were told of Odysseus in Odysseus's time were for the benefit of those people at that time. And the stories of Odysseus that we have today are for the benefit of more contemporary audiences, for us, right? So I think that the language reflects that, the storytelling reflects that very well, I think.
Right, and that connects back to something that I had mentioned earlier, that in many ways Odysseus the Rebel is a story about storytelling and the power of storytelling and the need and significance of storytelling. So in this way, this is a webcomic that, depending on how you define it, is quite metafictional. It's fiction about the creation of fiction. Now, it's not metafictional in the way, let's say, that John Barth is metafictional, right? Where you have a narrative that keeps referring back to itself in a way that becomes quite dizzying. But it's the kind of metafiction that talks about the power of narrative and how that can create reality.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's actually, as I'm sitting here thinking on it, I'm reflecting on Brian Talbot's book from a few years back, Alice in Sunderland. I don't know if you saw that one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's been a long time since I read it. I love that book.
Yeah, but that's the same kind of thing, right?
Right.
Ostensibly, it's about, Lewis Carroll and how he wrote Alice in Wonderland and all the, 6 degrees of separation that go along with that. But when you really look at it, it's really a book about storytelling. And, not only the storytelling of, words on a page or images in a book, but also the storytelling, the narrative that we give ourselves, the storytelling that others project onto you. In your day-to-day life, we have, that's an old metaphor too. We're crafters of our own story, and I think this Talbot talked about that in Alice in Sunderland. I think Grant and Bieser are talking about that to some level here in Odysseus as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the design of this website, because, we have been talking about the design of the website, specifically on this episode. I know we talk about it on various other episodes, but we seem to keep bringing this up this month. And, I can tell that this is an older webcomic because it's not near as easy to navigate as a lot of webcomics we've discussed in the past. So, for instance, now, okay, granted, we're looking at the webcomic through Big Head Press's website. So there are other stories, there are other webcomics that you can read off of Big Head Press as well. But specifically looking at Odysseus the Rebel, when you go to the first page, you see in essence an announcement that the book is now out in print. But if you click on that page, then it takes you to the first page. And so, in other words, the story start. And then after that, you can click through subsequent pages by clicking on next page up at the top of the menu, or just the image itself, which I particularly appreciate. And then you can go to a previous chapter or a previous page, just as you can go the next page or the next chapter. What I wish were here to make it a little easier to navigate is an archive. And if there's an archive, I'm missing it.
No, I don't. I could not find one either. But I think this is one of those that's a reflection of when it was created, right? Because we're going back to 2003 when this was started, and the navigation kind of reflects that. When you think about what was going on in webcomics in 2003, that was still very much I don't want to say questionable, but certainly not a defined career path, right? There was not such a thing as a webcomics profession. If you did webcomics, it was kind of something on the side, or maybe just as kind of a portfolio piece or something like that. There were very few people. I want to say maybe one or two that were actually making a living at webcomics at that point. Mm-hmm. So in that context, there was still a lot going on and people trying to figure out how to display webcomics and how they should function. So I think there was a lot of things like an archive, like an about page, like an author page, that have since become standard practice that were not standard practice at that time. Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying when we were talking earlier in the show, is that people would come up with this great idea for a navigation piece, and other people would start stealing it. Right? No one had started stealing an about page yet, because that wasn't a standard thing yet. No one had started stealing an archive yet, because no one had was there to steal it from at that point. So that ends up being the challenge with not only this, but a lot of the completed webcomics that we end up doing is if they're old enough, they're going to have navigation that reflects their age and that the time that they were created. And nobody did archives back in 2003. Nobody did about pages back in 2003,
right?
Or very, very few people. So that we end up having a bit of a challenge reading it today. I mean, it's not a huge challenge, but it's still less than an ideal experience compared to other current webcomics, because they have a navigation reflective of, in this case, 15 years ago.
True. Now, and that all makes perfect sense. However, we are dealing with a medium here, the web, right, and web page creation, where it's easy enough to change things, even with something that's been up for years and years. Granted, it may take quite a bit of work to update things, but the creator is still able to do so. I mean, very different from print, right? So if there's a problem with the first print run of a particular book, then you have to wait until the next printing, if there is a next printing, to change that. Whereas with webcomic creation, say, you just go into the design and you tweak it, you add to it, you change things around, shake it up a bit, and it's fixed, no matter how long the website has been up. Now I'm not expecting necessarily the creators, Grant and Bieser, to do that with Odysseus the Rebel, but one of the things I can say, though, and it impressed me quite a bit, is the fact that not only can you go through this webcomic page by page, but you can also both, forward and backward, but also chapter by chapter. So I think that, especially for that time, that was quite sophisticated.
Yeah, that was something that nobody was doing, I don't think, at that time. And they did. I don't know if it was necessarily an innovation per se, but it was something that was certainly unusual. And just the fact that they were doing a long-form serial webcomic was somewhat unusual in the first place. There were not that many people doing the serial format back then, serial dramatic format, certainly. Mm-hmm. So I think that, again, I don't know that they were necessarily innovators, but they were certainly on the front edge of what those kind of webcomics could be and what they could get to. So I think that, looking back on it now, or like I said, 15 years on here, they've got a less than ideal navigation setup, but it was progressive enough at that time that it still makes it a certainly usable site and a usable setup. It's not ideal, but it's not so bad that you're going to get frustrated trying to sort your way through the navigation and trying to read the webcomic online.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very easy to read this. That my little comment about the archive, may be more nitpicky for some people than otherwise. But yeah, it's definitely something that we highly recommend people check out, whether they're fans of Homer's Odyssey or otherwise. Well, Sean, we had a jam-packed October. We started off by discussing Abby Howard's The Last Halloween. After that, we looked at Theora Kvitka's relatively new webcomic, Urbanity Planet. And then after a brief check-in with Jim and Paul on what they're doing with Poe and the Mysteriads, we wrapped up with Steve Grant and Scott Bieser's Odysseus the Rebel.
Lots of fun stuff. That's one of the great things I love about doing this show is that we're always finding these great comics to talk about and look at, and always a pleasure going through all these. I really enjoy it. Yeah,
it is fun. And if you want to find fun comics, both hard copy and digital, then you can check out the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service, as well as their sister company, My Digital Comics. So either dcbservice.com or mydigitalcomics.com. You can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about this month's episode of the webcomic series. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message from the comfort of your own computing device through SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And also, if you'd like to send us a note through email, maybe you've got a webcomic you'd like us to check out, send us a link to. We're always great, appreciative and grateful for seeing those. So you can send us an email at twoguyes@comicsalternative.com. That's TWOGUYS at comicsalternative.com. Or you can send me an email directly at Sean@comicsalternative.com.
And you can contact me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, and on iHeartRadio. And if you're an Android user, via Google Play Music. But you can still find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
We should really just truncate that whole sequence down to just say, go to comicsalternative.com, because that's got everything.
Exactly, yeah. Go to our Contact Us page.
Go to our Contacts page and just do something there.
Yeah, but, I like to get a little specific each episode about where people can get in touch with us.
Absolutely.
In case they forget.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and, as Sean pointed out a second ago, we do like to get suggestions from you guys. So get in touch with us either via email or social media, just somehow, and let us know what kind of webcomics you're reading and what you think we should discuss on the show. And until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean. Happy Halloween, and we'll see you next month.
Bye-bye.